Chapter 407, The Battlefield 1. O Lord, 1. As his believer called out to him, Ogoroth opened his eyes. He had been resting for about an hour. The call that had come from right next to him was spoken at a low volume, but apart from that, all of the other sounds in his vicinity were extremely loud. There was the sound of metal objects such as spears and swords clashing together, the sound of slicing, stabbing and crushing, and also the sound of screams and loud roars. The sound of various things milling around also created booming and rattling thuds. And among all of this chaos, there was a high frequency of bestial screeching that couldn't have come from any human tongue. Brushing back his shaggy hair, Ogoroth muttered, "Is the situation still the same?" "Yes, my lord." His believer's voice came to him from an inappropriately close distance, practically whispering into his ear. Her sweet, warm breath tickled his ear and cheek as she spoke. Ordinarily, he would have pushed her away in disgust, but right now, even as a joke, there was no way the current situation could be called ordinary. Ogoroth was familiar with war. He was also familiar with the battlefield. However, strangely enough, he couldn't feel any sense of familiarity from this war. While feeling an irritating sense of discomfort, Ogoroth clicked his tongue. "Will you be ordering a retreat?" the woman continued to whisper with a giggle. In this turbulent era that was brought about by the demon king of incarceration, this woman was a court witch who had once turned the king and all of the ministers of a country into her puppets, placing the entire kingdom beneath her feet. At one time she had been called the Twilight Witch and was regarded as an object of reverence. In a certain sense, this witch had been even worse than the demon folk and the demon kings. After placing the country beneath her feet, she had trained her subjects into total obedience using the stick of terror and the carrot of pleasure, and her terrifying notoriety had made even the monarchs of the surrounding countries avert their gaze from her actions. But this was a story from long ago. Among the countless wars that Ogoroth had fought and won, the toppling of the Twilight Witch had just been one of them. In the heart of her ruined castle, the Twilight Witch had begged him not to kill her but instead take her as his prize. Nowadays, the Twilight Witch had become a saint and the high priest of the god of war. In the countless wars that had been waged by Ogoroth, she had faithfully served as his advisor, and that remained the case even now. She might have a playful and light-hearted smile on her face, but a cold and calculating look had settled in the saint's eyes. Even though the current battle has gone on for so long, there is still no end in sight. "My lord, your divine army is brave and will never tire, and so long as you exist, their morale shall never falter." However, the saint hesitated. "I know," Ogoroth assured her as he rose from his chair. "This war is very different from those we have fought until now. It was not a matter of difficulty. You could tell that just by looking at the battle itself. If he had to rank them in terms of difficulty, there had been wars in the past that were much more difficult than this one. For example, when he had conquered the territories of some demon kings, there had been the demon king of fury who had shamelessly abandoned his men and escaped all by himself. The war against that demon king had been much more difficult than this war as a whole. However, up until now, as long as they managed to repeatedly win the most difficult battles, they would eventually be able to achieve victory in the war itself. But what about now? This battle itself didn't pose any difficulty. These monsters might be able to destroy an ordinary country in a single instant, but they were nothing compared to the army that followed Ogoroth. Since the war against these monsters had begun, Ogoroth's army had yet to suffer even a single defeat. "We have already achieved countless victories, but the war has yet to end," Ogoroth sighed. That was the problem. This war just would not end. They couldn't even see any signs of how to end it. Each time the monsters were annihilated in battle, new monsters would just appear. Moreover, this cycle was gradually growing shorter. At first, it had taken the monsters 3 or 4 days to reappear, but at some point, it had become 2 days, then 1 day, and now, after wiping them out, new monsters would appear in just half a day. The monsters were weak. However, they weren't so weak that they could be easily stepped on and killed like a bug. "My lord, I urge you to retreat," the saint pleaded as she embraced Ogoroth's arm. Even now, after having defeated thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of these enemies, neither you nor I nor any of the soldiers have been able to fully comprehend the identity of our enemies. However, you must be able to feel most keenly the depths of our mysterious enemy's atrociousness, don't you, my lord? Ogoroth remained silent. The saint continued, "After all, our enemy's blood itself is poisonous and is able to erode away even your divine power. We have managed to endure this until now because your presence transformed the entire battlefield into a holy ground. If not for that, all of our soldiers would have gone insane and committed suicide or tried to tear each other to pieces. Agaroth had reached the same judgment. Within his sanctuary, the soldiers who served him would not tire as long as his divine power remained standing. Their minds would remain clear at all times, and even fatal injuries could recover immediately. However, now that was no longer the case. Just like the saint had said, the poisonous blood leaking from the corpses of the defeated enemies was eating away at Agaroth's divine power. Though rather than his soldiers, Agaroth was the one to feel this impact even more deeply. The saint apologized, "Pardon me for speaking out of turn, but if we continue to fight here, and what happens if we do retreat?" Agaroth interrupted the saint as he shook his arm free from her grasp. "If we retreat, do you think those monsters will remain here? Their goal is to completely eradicate all living beings, no matter how far they need to travel. There is no need to reconfirm it at this point. After all, they've already left several destroyed countries in their wake. My lord, there is a saying that you should fight poison with poison. What if your divine army leads the enemies away and diverts them towards the Devildom instead? After this tide of monsters destroys all of the countries of the continent, they should then advance towards the Devildom in any case, so why don't we let the demon folk and demon kings, whom you so hate, fight the monsters in our stead?" the saint proposed. "Are you seriously saying that?" Agaroth glanced towards the saint. He thought she might just be making an inappropriate joke, but the look on her face seemed to say that was not the case. After looking into the saint's coldly collected eyes, Agaroth shrugged. The god of giants has conveyed his intention to lead his followers to join the divine army. And also the sage has said that she will be coming as well. The saint burst into laughter before Agaroth had even finished speaking. She tilted her head to the side as she looked up into Agaroth's eyes. Her disdain was obvious within those purple eyes that shone as brilliantly as carved gems. "My lord, pardon me for questioning you, but do you really think their support will be of any help?" the saint demanded. Agaroth did not respond. "This is a war that even you, who are known as the god of war, cannot handle," the saint pointed out. "Of course, I'm aware that the god of giants is as immense and strong as his name suggests. Some say that the god of giants can lift the entire continent with just one hand, but according to my calculations, while he might find it difficult to do it with just one hand, it seems doable if he were to use both of his hands." Agaroth snorted. As for the sage, "Yes, that vicious woman is a great wizard who has reached such heights of magic that I will never be able to touch. But the eternal truth that that woman pursues will not be able to lead us to victory in this war." The saint took a step closer as she continued to speak. Her hand reached out and invaded Agaroth's personal space again. Her long fingers began to trace the muscles of his forearms. The saint licked her lips in a blatant show of sensuality. Gradually, the saint's hand wandered up towards Agaroth's neck. "My lord," the saint seductively whispered. "In the first place, is winning this war really so important to you? Your greatest desire has always been to slay every last demon king, so killing these monsters of unknown origin is just... You overstep yourself." Agaroth's eyes narrowed in warning. The saint felt a chill go down her spine, but she didn't step back immediately. Instead, she continued to caress the side of Agaroth's neck. The saint pleaded, "My lord, please do not be offended by my words. Every word that comes from my lips is spoken only for your sake." Agaroth stared at the saint with calm, sunken eyes. His gaze felt sharp as it focused on her. It was as if it could pierce a hole straight through her lungs. However, instead of feeling afraid, the saint felt as if the inside of her body felt warmed by his gaze. "I'm already aware of that," Agaroth admitted. "In the end, by prolonging this war, all I am doing is cutting away at my own flesh." If things had gone according to his plans, his war against the demon king of incarceration would have already begun by now. When he had first arrived at the end of the continent and confronted these monsters, he had thought that the war taking place here would merely serve as combat training for the upcoming battle against the demon king of incarceration. But to retreat now, Agaroth seriously considered the saint's advice. It was impossible to just ignore these monsters altogether. Should he ask for cooperation from the gods and nations allied to him? Would he be able to wage his war against the demon king of incarceration while they took over the duty of blocking these monsters? That's impossible. Agaroth shook his head. There was no way that these monsters didn't have a source somewhere producing them. Because such a source existed, these monsters could continue to appear like this. If he could just succeed in eliminating that source, but he had already thought about that dozens, even hundreds of times before. Ever since this war had begun, various methods had been used to try and find the source of these monsters, but they had all failed. It was like these things had just suddenly appeared out of nowhere. There weren't any signs of them being summoned either. They truly seemed to have manifested out of nothingness. Could a demon king be the one sending these monsters at them? Agaroth had also had such a thought numerous times. Agaroth had slain several demon kings so far, and he had also found a lot of information on those demon kings that he had yet to kill. But as far as he knew, among the demon kings who were still alive, no demon king existed who could be so powerful to have innumerable monsters under their command. But although he knew many things, that did not mean he knew everything about the demon kings. The source of these monsters. For some reason, the name of a certain demon king appeared in Agaroth's mind. The demon king of destruction. Agaroth had been waging war against the Devil Dom for a long time, but he had never once encountered the demon king of destruction. The demon king of destruction didn't claim any territory like the other demon kings. He didn't even have any vassals sworn to him. He also did not go around invading other countries. Because of that, he was a demon king no one would be able to find even if one went looking for him. Not much was known about the demon king of destruction. That was because most of those who did encounter that demon king perished, and of those who barely managed to survive, they had all gone insane. Thanks to that, Agaroth hadn't rushed to make a connection between the monsters that had suddenly appeared here and the demon king of destruction. However, if the master of these monsters indeed was the demon king of destruction, in that case, just how terrible of an existence must the demon king of destruction be? If all of these many monsters, whose numbers were endless even though they were killed time after time, were the subjects of the demon king of destruction, then what on earth must the demon king of destruction be like? There's no way that they are truly endless, Agaroth told himself as he tried to restrain his growing anxiety. He couldn't allow himself to fear an enemy he had yet to face. Agaroth opened the door of his tent and headed out. Brr. The battle cries resounded from nearby. And just beyond those high walls lay the battlefield. When Agaroth emerged, the soldiers who had been resting outside turned to look at him. They didn't get to their feet, kneel, or bow down to him. It was true that they all worshipped Agaroth, but Agaroth and his soldiers didn't have a relationship like that of a lord and his subordinates or a god and his believers, but instead, they were all comrades in arms. The situation? Agaroth demanded. It's the same as it has been until now, a hulking giant replied. The man was a passionate believer who had the symbols of Agaroth tattooed all over his body, and he was also a mighty warrior who was both trusted and valued by Agaroth, having followed Agaroth since before he had ascended to godhood. Agaroth glanced at the mighty warrior and grumbled, "You should have taken command of the battle while I was taking a short break inside the fort. What are the men supposed to do if you're in here as well?" "Damn it, Captain," the warrior spat, "it's not like I'm here to just slack off. 3. How am I? After all, I've only come here for a brief rest after I was injured while fighting at the front." This wasn't just an empty excuse. The mighty warrior's body truly was covered in wounds, and he had just been in the middle of applying some medicine to those wounds by himself. At this sight, Agaroth clicked his tongue and raised his head. A dark red ball of light shone down from the center of a cloudy sky. Although it looked very much like the sun, it was not actually the sun. It was a miracle that had been created through Agaroth's divine power. Wherever the light of this dark red sun reached, the place was transformed into holy ground, and while on such holy ground, his believers' wounds would. "Damn it," Agaroth cursed. Usually, while on holy ground, such wounds would have healed directly without Agaroth even needing to pay any attention to it. Agaroth let out a sigh and flicked his hand towards the mighty warrior. Crackle. A surge of divine power flowed into the body of the mighty warrior, and his wounds were healed instantly. The warrior groaned, "Arg, I really hate it when you do that. After all, it shortens our lifespan, doesn't it? Even if it does, it will hurt less, so you will still live longer than if your wounds remained as they were." Agaroth responded without the slightest bit of change in his expression. His miracles might be able to heal wounds in an instant, but the cost of doing so was taken from Agaroth's own divine power as well as the lifespan of the patient. However, Agaroth didn't really think much of such a cost. After all, if they really wanted to live as long as their lifespan allowed, they should have gotten away from the battlefield. If someone insisted that they wanted to live a long life even after choosing to come to the battlefield and fight, then that person would be spouting a load of bullshit. If you're all better, then let's go, Ogoroth said as he strode off. Ah, Captain, hold on, the mighty warrior who had gotten up to follow Ogoroth suddenly called out to Ogoroth and handed over a ring that he had just pulled off of his finger. Thanks for letting me borrow it. Ogoroth hummed assessingly. It seems you drained quite a lot of its divine power. But even with that, you weren't able to end the battle. We almost managed to finish it a few times, but every time we drew close they kept getting more reinforcements, so we weren't able to finish them off in the end, the warrior explained. Ogoroth put the ring back onto his ring finger. All of the soldiers who had been taking a rest got up and followed after Ogoroth. Grinned. The wall gates began to open of their own accord. Ogoroth frowned. Reinforcements? So now we're finding it difficult to even wipe out a wave of them? The warrior shrugged. If you were to fight them personally, Captain, you should be able to annihilate them easily. Though they'll probably just reappear again later. These damn bastards, Ogoroth cursed. Having fought this far, we can proudly say that we've done our best, so how about we leave this problem up to another god and just head back on our own? Don't say something that you don't mean, the mighty warrior who had been serving Ogoroth for so long replied to the joke without even a single moment of hesitation. Good luck, for... As Ogoroth and his soldiers were heading out through the gates, the saint climbed up to the top of the walls and shouted her encouragement to them while waving away with both hands. While it was true that she was a high priest and a saint of the god of war, she rarely went out to the battlefield and fought in person. Rather than letting her play around like that, how about taking her with us and making her fight? The mighty warrior grumbled. It's not like this is the first time you've seen her act like that. Just let her be, Ogoroth said dismissively. The warrior sighed. Even now, after 10 whole years have gone by, I still don't understand why you took in that evil woman, Captain. Her head actually works very fast when it comes to certain things. Unlike you or I, who only know how to fight, she's also good at things like management. Ogoroth excused his decision. After all, the Twilight Witch had once ruled an entire country. Even the mighty warrior was forced to recognize that she possessed such an ability. However, now that they had grown to this point, was there still a need for Ogoroth to keep her at his side? When he first took the Twilight Witch as his prisoner, Ogoroth hadn't been a god, and there weren't many talented and resourceful people around him. But after becoming a god, Ogoroth had gathered into his company some of the greatest heroes from all across the continent, including ones who could have replaced the saint in her role. In the end, you just can't throw her away because you've grown attached to her, right? The mighty warrior accused. Ogoroth accepted the accusation calmly. It's not like I've ever denied it. The warrior snorted. We should have just killed her then. I'm just curious, but did she ever do anything particularly offensive to you? Why do you still hate her so much? Ogoroth asked. The warrior complained. Captain, while I'm fighting hard in your stead, shedding my sweat and blood, that fucking slut just keeps cheering us on from behind and going into the captain's tent to do some shady things. Don't say things that could be easily misunderstood, Ogoroth scolded. We're not in that kind of relationship. Of course, I know that, Captain, but if you and that fucking slut really were to end up in that kind of relationship, the mighty warrior shivered. Phew, it's terrifying to even imagine it. With a bitch like her, who's so skilled at wrapping men around her fingers. Even you might not be able to escape the pull of her skirt, Captain. I'm not just any ordinary man, Ogoroth corrected him. Also, it's not like I'm the only one who hates that bitch, the mighty warrior said defensively. Even the sage secretly asks me whenever she occasionally visits, so just when are you going to execute her? It's not like she's done anything terrible enough to justify her death, and I'm leaving her alone because she's both loyal and helpful to me, Ogoroth replied while staring ahead with a grim expression on his face. All across the wide plain before him, he saw that the battle was in full swing. So many monsters were approaching from the horizon that they filled his entire field of view. After roughly estimating their numbers, Ogoroth nodded. I'll get rid of them for now, Ogoroth firmly stated. Yes, sir, the mighty warrior readily accepted this claim. Ogoroth gave the orders. If there are any of the men whose wounds haven't recovered, carry them back into the fort. And if any of the men are dead, take care of their bodies. Yes, sir, the mighty warrior nodded. Ogoroth's figure disappeared. At some point he had already flown high up into the distant sky, leaving the battlefield behind him. When he glanced down, the heads of the monsters were so densely packed that he couldn't even see the ground beneath their feet. There's a disgusting number of them today as well, Ogoroth grumbled as he stretched out his hands. The divine power gathered between his palms took the form of a large divine sword. 1. The original Korean text uses a term that translates as a respectful way to address God. Using "Oh God" seems a bit strange, so I borrowed from Christian tradition to substitute Lord in place of God. 2. The original text uses a specific word that means to respect something while also keeping a distance from it. After some consideration, I felt that reverence should give the same sense of respectful distance. 3. The original text uses the Korean idiom of sucking up honey, which basically means to be a wage thief who is resting while all of his co-workers are busy working. 4. The original text uses the English word fighting, which Korean people use to encourage each other when facing difficult challenges. 5. The original Korean text uses the idiom of cooking and serving a man, which has the same meaning of being able to make a man do whatever you want him to. Chapter 408, The Battlefield 2. Each time Agaroth swung his divine sword, the world was carved apart by red lines. Resistance was impossible once something was swallowed or even touched by those lines. Any contact with those lines meant death. As the god of war, Agaroth's divine power proved to be fittingly violent. But even though he had killed thousands of monsters in a single instant, there were still countless monsters gathered beneath his feet. Wherever he looked, all he could see were monsters. Only when he turned his head and looked far behind him did he see something different. The fortress in which they had withstood the monsters for so long. Although it was called a fortress, apart from the outer walls, no other structures were contained within. These walls were the only feature in this otherwise barren land. At one point, this place had been the capital of a kingdom. However, now there wasn't even a single trace of that kingdom remaining. When they had first arrived in this land, everywhere they looked, all they could see were terrible sights. No, it was not just this land. The same went for each of the kingdoms that had been destroyed by these monsters. As for the people who once had lived in them, imagine the sight of tens of millions of corpses left unattended in the open air for months. Even the word hellish was not enough to describe such a scene. Although Agaroth and his army had all been through countless wars, his soldiers had still ended up vomiting, and honestly speaking, Agaroth himself had almost felt the gorge rise up in his throat when he witnessed that sight and the accompanying stench. Let alone the Devildom, even among all the countries invaded by the demon kings, he had never seen such a terrible and disgusting scene. That was why he had erased it all. The corpses had rotted away long ago, and the ruins of the kingdoms had already developed into a disgusting ecosystem centered around the countless dead bodies. So Agaroth had erased everything, including the remaining ruins. That was how this plane had been created. A barren landscape that was made when Agaroth had personally erased all of the countless human corpses and the city in which those innumerable humans had once lived. But after that, just like how it had once been carpeted with human corpses, the monster corpses that were now strewn across the ground far outnumbered the former human corpses. It might be presumptuous, but in Agaroth's opinion, no other land in human history had witnessed as much death as this one. Just what on earth are they? Agaroth muttered to himself. He could not count just how many times he had already asked this question. These monsters didn't seem to feed on people. That said, they did not feast on each other either. The blood they spilled didn't appear to be able to seep away into the ground, and ordinary flames couldn't erase their corpses or any of the other traces they left behind. Only the flames personally created by Agaroth through his divine power were able to eradicate their corpses. Such abominable monsters were currently gnashing their teeth at Agaroth and letting out screeches. The sounds they made didn't form any language. Just like the word screech suggested, it was just bestial screaming. These monsters were as diverse in type and size as they were in appearance. Some walked on 2 legs like humans while others walked on 4. Still, others had even more legs and crawled around like insects. Naturally, there were also some that flew through the skies on flapping wings. In no time at all, hundreds of such flying monsters had gathered around Agaroth. The sound of their flapping wings even managed to drown out the ruckus of their cries. Agaroth narrowed his eyes and held out his left hand. Dark red divine power swirled on his palm as he curled his fingers into a tight fist. Ruhr. The divine power that burst out from his fist transformed into a storm that spread out in all directions. Hundreds of monsters were slaughtered in an instant, and their blood and flesh poured down like rain. Boom. Accompanied by a thunderous noise, monsters as large as giants leaped towards Agaroth with their hands outstretched. Agaroth just swung his divine sword without the slightest change in expression. His slash was not accompanied by a burst of sound. The divine sword, which Agaroth had forged through refining his own divine power, did not create any extraneous effects when it was just swung like this. But there was no way that something like these monsters would be able to stand up to a divine sword that even demon kings would find difficult to deal with. As expected, Agaroth thought as he looked down below with narrowed eyes. Since the start of their battle, Agaroth had continued to swing his divine sword numerous times. In these short few moments, a rough estimate would put the number of monsters that had been killed by Agaroth well into the thousands. Despite this, the tide of monsters below showed no signs of abating. The reason for this was simple. As many monsters as Agaroth may have killed, new monsters just kept reappearing. This was such an absurd sight. However, such complaints had already been made a long time ago. Things like common sense did not seem to apply to these monsters. It makes sense that they weren't able to end this battle, Agaroth realized. Next to Agaroth, the mighty warrior was the second strongest in the divine army. If he wasn't able to finish the battle, even after Agaroth had lent him his personal ring that would allow the warrior to draw on Agaroth's divine power directly, there had to be a good reason for it. Despite being a soldier sworn to the god of war, no matter how strong the mighty warrior might be, it was still impossible for him to annihilate so many monsters simultaneously. But what should they do with the battles from now on? Even though they kept killing them time after time instead of their numbers decreasing even slightly, the amount of enemies just kept increasing. While feeling irritated, Agaroth raised his divine sword high into the air. Crackergow! The dark red blade of the divine sword extended, growing long enough that it seemed like it could touch the sky. So when Agaroth swung the gigantic divine sword, the world was literally split apart. Even after the divine sword had already passed through the air, the trail of its slash did not disappear. Instead, it spread outwards to engulf the surrounding monsters. The end of the ever-expanding slash connected right back to its beginning. This created a ring of dark red divine power that swept over the battlefield. After watching this for a few moments, Agaroth turned to look at the sky. The sun made from his divine power was still floating high up there. When Agaroth reached out towards it and pulled, the sun slowly floated closer to Agaroth. Roar! The sun began to spray down flames of divine power. The wave of flames covered everything below. After burning through the monsters, the divine power didn't just disappear but instead repeatedly changed its form as it followed Agaroth's will. The divine power first transformed into an enormous blade that cut another swathe through the monsters, then into thousands of arrows that shot through the horde before reforming back into a hammer that flattened even more of the monsters. Now that Agaroth's massacre had begun in earnest, the speed at which the monsters were dying finally exceeded the speed at which the monsters were appearing. It was as if 100 monsters were being killed for every 10 monsters that suddenly appeared. Even as he conducted this massacre, Agaroth still had a lot of leeway to handle other matters. So, as he was sweeping through the monsters on the front line, he was also keeping an eye on the state of the battle at the rear lines and was intervening whenever necessary. This wasn't a difficult matter for him. All of those who were fighting here were followers of Agaroth, so all he needed to do in order to perform a life-saving miracle was send them as much divine power as they needed. The saint, who was still standing atop the walls, also played a role in this matter. Across the vast distance their eyes met. The saint pushed out her lips towards Agaroth, making a smooching noise, then winked an eye at him. "Crazy bitch," Agaroth muttered. At some point the monsters had stopped appearing. With that, today's battle at the very least had come to an end. Considering the time, the next battle would probably resume tomorrow. Though perhaps, just perhaps, it might start even sooner. Agaroth's brow furrowed as he stared down below. The plain was packed full of corpses that had yet to be incinerated by his divine power, and the ominous poison that these corpses were spilling was causing Agaroth a headache. Even if he burned the corpses to the point where no smoke or even ashes remained, that would still leave him with the poison to deal with, and it was also disgusting to leave so many corpses unattended. With an air of ease, Agaroth conjured up flames of divine power. Fwoosh! A wall of flames began to crawl over the earth. Even without Agaroth needing to pay attention to them, these flames would burn all the remaining corpses. Agaroth turned his back to the wall of flames and headed towards the fortress. The divine army was still fighting over there, but since there weren't many monsters left, it seemed like the battle there would be ending soon. But even this cleanup wasn't a very satisfying sight for Agaroth. Seeing his soldiers like this, Agaroth had confirmed something. The divine army was indeed weaker than what they had been at first, and the same went for Agaroth. This was because their minds and bodies were becoming increasingly exhausted and worn out as the war continued without any apparent end in sight. It really is time for us to take a break, Agaroth decided. Now that he thought about it, they hadn't had a proper day off since they had first arrived here. After all, once each battle had ended, their preparations for the next battle always took too long for any of them to rest properly. It might be impossible for Agaroth to order a full retreat, but once the god of giants or the sage arrived, he would ask them to take charge of this place for about a month, allowing his divine army to get some rest. Agaroth suddenly stiffened. There was an unnatural feeling coming from behind him. It was almost ominous, but the sensations coming from the presence could not be so easily labeled. There was an almost instinctive sense of unease rising within him, along with a terror that Agaroth didn't wish to admit to. Agaroth immediately turned to look behind him. He saw the wall of flames still soaring high enough to touch the sky, but something was squirming away inside those flames. Agaroth couldn't sense what that thing was. There seemed to be something like a shadow flickering within the flames, almost like a haze. It seemed to both exist and not exist, with even its form left ambiguous. Whoosh! That something suddenly swallowed up all of the flames. It looked as if a huge hole had been punched into the flames and was now sucking everything in. It was only after the flames had entirely disappeared that Agaroth was able to see that something more clearly. That thing looked as if a hole had been torn open in the world. The colors surrounding the hole were being pulled in and blended together. The fusion of colors was unstable, with each shade growing and shrinking as they all mixed together, creating all sorts of visual distortions, so the boundary between what was still in the world and what wasn't very clear. But in the center, at the very center of the hole, Agaroth instinctively stared at that spot. Even amidst the riot of all sorts of different colors, only one color existed in the very center. A pitch-black darkness. The deep darkness in the center of the hole seemed to be sucking everything towards it. What the Agaroth murmured in an uncertain voice as he took a step back. Hurry! The monster corpses that had yet to be burned were being dragged towards the hole. At that moment, Agaroth couldn't help but feel a shiver run down his spine. Through the hole, he had sensed an ominous and immense presence, one that had a slight demonic aura mixed in with it. That alone may not have been enough to identify that existence, but this terrible and ominous entity clearly possessed dark power. In other words, that meant this thing's true identity was that of a demon king. The demon king of destruction, Agaroth muttered in horror. If that thing truly was a demon king, then apart from destruction, there was no other epitaph it might possess. That was just how unstoppable and absolute the aura of destruction that Agaroth could sense coming from that entity was. What was the demon king of destruction doing here? Wasn't it said that destruction, who didn't act like any of the other demon kings, never left the Devildom? How could they have suddenly appeared here without any warning? For a moment, Agaroth didn't know what to think. My lord! The saint cried out from her place at the top of the fortress wall. She could also sense what an incomprehensible existence Agaroth was currently facing. Even though she was viewing it from such a long distance, it felt like her mind was going insane, and her very soul was being polluted by the sight. Nevertheless, the saint didn't turn her head away and instead cried out to her god, even as she was shedding dark tears of blood. You can't. Please, my lord. The saint begged. They wanted to run away. Such a thought filled everyone's head. Even the mighty warrior who among all of Agaroth's countless believers had followed him for the longest time, could not muster up any bravery at this moment. He wanted to throw away the sword in his hand. He wanted to pull off his armor so that he could run away even just a little bit faster. When even the mighty warrior had such thoughts, how could the other soldiers be any less terrified? There were many who fell to the ground in fear, and there were also plenty who dropped their weapons. However, not a single one of them actually ran away as fast as they could. This was because they were still within the range of Agaroth's holy ground. It was because the dark red sun still hung in the skies above them. Their faith in Agaroth allowed the divine army to resist the terror they were feeling. It made it so that none fled the battlefield even if they had already lost their will to fight. This was possible only because Agaroth himself refused to run away. It was because Agaroth was still resisting his own feelings of terror. Agaroth was facing the demon king of destruction at a closer distance than anyone else. Since he was the guardian deity of this holy ground, He was forced to bear the brunt of the enormous pressure emanating from the Demon King of Destruction. So Agaroth felt like he was going crazy. It felt like his godhood itself was about to be crushed. Whether when he was still a human or after becoming a god, Agaroth had never once thought of himself as an insignificant existence. When he was a human, he believed that he was the most exceptional talent among all humans. He wasn't entirely wrong to think so. From the time he was a human, he had stood on the same battlefields as gods and had killed a few demon kings while saving numerous countries. And after he had become a god, he still didn't have any respect for his elder gods either. A massive war was currently being fought against the demon kings and demon folk. In such an era of strife, it was a quick matter for heroes to write their own legends and attain godhood. So in this current era, there were many young gods just like Agaroth. However, even they didn't seem so impressive in Agaroth's eyes. The only gods that Agaroth treated as an equal, or rather slightly lower than himself, were the barbaric but enormous god of giants and the sage, who sought to save the world from her ivory tower. For this young and arrogant god of war, his current emotions were extremely unfamiliar to him, feelings of inferiority, of being a lower level of life form, and such shitty feelings. Agaroth silently clenched his jaw. In his right hand he was still holding his divine sword. He did not need to look at it to know that the light of the divine sword had dimmed. He could feel the terror in his pounding chest. This terror was stifling his will to fight and dulling his edge. Agaroth strengthened his grip on the sword. He used his rage and frustration to erase the fear in his heart. "Please, my lord." The saint's scream wasn't heard with his ears this time around, but instead inside Agaroth's head. When he focused his senses in that direction, he could hear so many similar voices. "What is that? I'm scared. Why did something like that suddenly appear? Just what am I doing here? I want to run away. Please, I don't want to die. Oh Lord, please give us permission to run away. My lord, please don't just stand there like that." Agaroth just listened silently. He could even hear voices coming from much further away. "What should I cook for dinner tonight? Is mother doing okay? When is that guy going to come home? Let's have another glass, no, 2 more glasses of beer. Is he really going to show up here? I just need to work a little more. It will be payday soon. I love you. I miss you. Thank God. You did well today. Tomorrow. Run away. Don't bullshit me," Agaroth growled. The divine army that Agaroth had led here wasn't the full sum of all of Agaroth's believers. Followers of Agaroth lived all over the continent. Their faith was the source of Agaroth and the divine army's strength. "If we run from here, just what are we supposed to do about that?" Agaroth scoffed. Agaroth didn't know all that much about the Demon King of Destruction. However, he instinctively realized at least this much. If they didn't stop that thing here and now, then something terrible would happen. That thing would go on to destroy the entire world. Also, there's no way that thing will just let us run away, Agaroth muttered with a dry chuckle. He didn't sense any hostility or murderous intent coming from that Demon King. But even without sensing such things from it, Agaroth knew just what it wanted. This was the Demon King of Destruction. It existed to kill everything without ever showing any mercy. The reason why it would continue to kill and destroy everything in its path wasn't due to any murderous intent, hostility, hatred, or any such emotions. For the Demon King, it was just in its nature to do so. "Everyone," Agaroth shouted. Gritting his teeth in determination, Agaroth lifted his right hand into the air. "Your feelings of wanting to run away. I've listened to them closely. However, I can't accept them. After all, if we all just ran away whenever we wanted to, what was the point of going to war? Unfortunately, the god that you've chosen to serve is a stubborn and vicious fucker. According to the judgment of this damned god of yours, there is absolutely no way that we can run away now. Because of that, you all will be dying here today. There are no other options. All of you will definitely perish here." Agaroth gave his final order, "Follow me. And I'll be dead along with you," Agaroth silently promised. Chapter 409, The Battlefield 3. The divine sword that had been lifted high into the air fell forward. Agaroth's holy ground also began to advance. Agaroth wasn't unaware of the terror that everyone was feeling. His current actions also weren't done out of personal courage, because Agaroth himself couldn't muster up any courage in the face of this battle. It was all forced. They were only doing this because the circumstances had forced them to do so. Agaroth was much more vividly aware of one inevitable fact than anyone else here. "Today I am going to die." Agaroth had already accepted this fact. If they wanted to avoid dying, then the only method seemed to be running away. But regardless of whether that was even possible, Agaroth had never even considered the idea of running away. So he completely disregarded the opinions of his believers in this matter. Once one agreed to take part in something like a war, there would be times when one would be forced to do something that one didn't want to do. For Agaroth, now was just such a time. Agaroth growled. Space itself was split apart as the divine sword slashed towards the demon king of destruction. Although this was the divine sword that Agaroth had been confident could slice through anything in this world, it still couldn't inflict even a single wound on the demon king of destruction. In the first place, it didn't seem like the demon king had anything resembling a body, so was it even possible for it to be injured? Currently, Agaroth couldn't sense the existence of anything like flesh, blood, or bones within the demon king of destruction. Though if that was the case, then what exactly was its existence even composed of? All that could be seen was the riot of all sorts of different colors caused by a spatial distortion and the black hole in the center of it all. It was unnatural. Exceptionally unnatural. Agaroth had killed many demon kings until now, but he had never once seen a demon king that looked like this. The other demon kings, even when they weren't human-like in appearance, had at least resembled living beings. However, what was going on with the demon king of destruction? It was clearly right in front of him, but he still couldn't feel any sense of life coming from it. The shudders coursing through him were causing Agaroth to breathe faster. Wrestling back control of his breathing, Agaroth voicelessly demanded, "Just what on earth are you?" However, there was no response. His attempts to converse with this thing were met with failure. Agaroth accepted this failure and used both hands to grip the divine sword. Crackergow. Agaroth mustered up all of his divine power. Even the dark red sun that was transforming this area into a holy ground drew closer to Agaroth. His soldiers roared from behind him. Despite being terrified and wanting to run away, his soldiers would obey the will of the god that they had sworn themselves to. Their god refused to run away from this battle. Their god wanted to keep fighting this battle, even if it meant that all his believers would be dying here today. Not only that, but Agaroth had also resolved himself to die here alongside them. Because of that, the believers could no longer remain frozen in fear. This was the battlefield, and the god that they had sworn themselves to was the god of war. If their god wanted them all to give their lives on this battlefield, then as his believers, they must offer their lives to him. The soldiers roared once more. Agaroth's divine army was made up of his most faithful followers, who would have gladly sacrificed their lives for him at any other time. But the presence of the demon king of destruction was stimulating the primal fear that all humans carried. However, this was their chance for glorious martyrdom. Even in the midst of the terror provoked by the demon king of destruction, their faith in Agaroth could not be erased. So most of the divine army charged forward, holding their weapons aloft and spitting out curses. The swirl of colors surrounding the demon king of destruction slowly began to spread out. The gradually expanding colors pushed back at Agaroth's divine power. Eventually, these colors transformed into a wall that met the soldiers as they charged forward, holding their weapons aloft and letting out roars. The wall of colors proved to be an attack for which there was no method to counter. The moment the soldiers reached those colors, which seemed to be eroding space itself, every attempt they made to break it failed. The colors themselves were made up of the dark power of destruction. The mana and divine power that was wrapped around the bodies of each of the divine army soldiers disappeared as soon as they touched the dark power of destruction, and the armor they were wearing wasn't able to resist such absolute power even for a moment. Was it truly possible that the lives of all of these men would continue to be wasted like this? This was Agaroth's divine army, the army that had won countless wars at his side and even overwhelmed the armies of the demon kings. But this very divine army was rapidly being turned into corpses as they advanced. The divine army continued to roar. Their comrades were dying right in front of them. Even so, they refused to back down. The soldiers of the divine army let out roars as they continued the attack. At the same time, Agaroth's name was chanted and a hymn was sung. At the moment of their deaths, instead of screaming, they each celebrated their martyrdom. As for Agaroth, he watched as the bodies of his believers were torn into pieces and scattered. He heard their cries. He felt it distinctly as each life was extinguished. Yet he couldn't allow himself to feel fear and despair. Those two types of emotions would just cause his body to freeze. What Agaroth needed right now was rage, hatred, and the fighting spirit that those emotions aroused. With a curse, Agaroth sliced at the dark power. With that, he made an opening in the swirling, corrosive wall of colors. He swung his divine sword again and again. The sunlight shining from the sun that was made up of his divine power collided with the dark power of destruction. Agaroth was trying to push the dark power back with his sunlight, but it wasn't working. Instead, it was Agaroth's own divine power that was getting erased each time the two touched. Agaroth's eyes shone with a red light. As a god of war who had won hundreds of thousands of battles, his eyes had already developed a special ability. Agaroth's eyes could see through an opponent, even if this was their first meeting. But he wasn't able to see anything from the Demon King of Destruction. He could only see the unbelievably large, ominous, and terrifying mass of dark power in front of him. And in the center of that chaos, where everything was mixing together, Agaroth still couldn't see anything, but it was obvious that something was there. So Agaroth decided to trust his intuition. Though this was also because he was left with no other choice but to do so. Boom. The divine army wasn't just dying pointlessly. Agaroth's second-in-command, the mighty warrior, a chosen of the god of war, looked to be in a state where it wouldn't be strange if he died at any moment. When his god had ordered the army to march forward, the mighty warrior had led the charge despite his own feelings of fear. He swung the great sword that his god had personally bestowed upon him, cutting through the dark power in front of him, and advanced forward. His left arm had already disappeared during the charge. Blood and internal organs were flowing out from his torn-open side. Nevertheless, the mighty warrior continued to swing his great sword as he let out a battle cry. "We've made it," Agaroth thought in relief. Through their combined efforts, they had gotten past the swirling colors and had reached a place that could lead them to the center of the Demon King of Destruction. The light of the divine sword suddenly dimmed. Would anything about their situation really change even if Agaroth did stab it? Agaroth didn't have even the slightest hope that he would truly be able to defeat the Demon King of Destruction with just his sword alone. Be that as it may, he still needed to thrust his sword forward. If he didn't even dare to attack now, then everything would truly just end without him having accomplished anything. The light of the divine sword intensified. Then from the center of the Demon King of Destruction, darkness unfolded. Agaroth opened his eyes. His ears didn't seem to be working well. And it wasn't just his hearing. Agaroth felt that most of his senses weren't working correctly. Even though his eyes had opened, he couldn't see anything clearly. The sensations coming from his own body were faint. However, he could still feel something. Inside of Agaroth, the voices of his believers could no longer be heard. The mighty warrior had died. That guy had wandered through the same battlefields with him for decades. Theirs wasn't a relationship like that of a captain and his subordinate or of a god and his follower, or at least not just like those. For Agaroth, the mighty warrior had been his most trusted confidant and friend. But he hadn't even been able to see how that guy had died. And it wasn't just him either. Agaroth coughed up a mouthful of blood. Most of the soldiers who had charged while following his orders had died. What just happened? Agaroth thought in confusion. The colors scattered apart. A voice came from right beside him. Agaroth blinked his still unseeing eyes. The voice continued to report, and then the center of that thing, the hole, began to spew out something black. In the next moment, everything around it was covered by the blackness. And when that black cloud disappeared, only corpses remained. "What is my condition?" Agaroth falteringly asked. He still couldn't feel any signals from his body. Such a state was truly unfamiliar to him. Unlike a human's body, the body of a god couldn't die from mortal wounds. Even if he lost his arms, legs, or even his head, as long as he had divine power remaining, he could still continue to fight. "The body parts that are missing are more than the ones that still remain," the voice, now recognized as the saint's, whispered. At least there wasn't any pain. Agaroth smiled as he coughed up more blood. "What about the Demon King of Destruction?" Agaroth asked. "He's following us from a distance," the saint replied. "From a distance?" Agaroth questioned. "Was I thrown here? Or did you carry me here?" "The answer to that is both. My lord, you were also swept up in that black hurricane, but you were thrown out without having been completely destroyed. At that moment, I threw myself in front of it for you," the saint whispered from an extremely close distance. Agaroth could feel her breath. Although his regeneration was slow, it seemed like it hadn't run out entirely. After coughing up a few more mouthfuls of blood, Agaroth continued speaking. you should run. His body slowly became able to move. Agaroth squinted his eyes, bleary sight having returned to them at last, and raised his left hand. Pulling off the ring on his right ring finger, he held it out towards the saint. Agaroth said, "This is my holy relic. If you use this, at least one of us will have escaped." "To think that you would order me to escape at this point," the saint scoffed. "If you were going to do that anyway, wouldn't it have been better if we had all escaped together right away?" Agaroth shook his head. "Just you?" The saint let out a laugh at Agaroth's words. "My lord, I am overwhelmed by how much you treasure me. Do you truly want me to live that badly?" Agaroth grunted in confirmation. This reply caused the saint to stop laughing. "So just run," Agaroth ordered. "Join up with the sage and the god of giants who should be heading this way. Tell them how I died. And warn the world that destruction is coming." The saint stayed silent. Agaroth continued, "And after that?" The saint suddenly shushed him while shaking her head. "My lord, you have decided that you are going to die here today in this spot, isn't that right?" "That's right," Agaroth nodded. "In that case," the saint paused. "Please don't worry about something righteous like what will happen to the world once I am dead. Something like that should be taken care of by those who come after you." Agaroth didn't say anything. "And your ring," the saint laughed. "I didn't want to receive it this way in a place like this. In fact, I didn't really expect to receive it all. However, Fufu, I'm quite happy to take it. My lord, I thank you for your favor." The saint's fingers gently traced the lines of Agaroth's cheek. "My lord, since this will be our last time together, I won't dawdle any longer and say one last thing. My lord, it doesn't matter to me what will happen to the world from now on," the saint admitted as her fingers trailed down his cheek and caressed Agaroth's lips. "If I had to say why, it is because the world without you has no meaning to me. My lord, the fact that you're dying here today for me is the same thing as the world ending." Agaroth just listened quietly. The saint continued, "Also, my lord, I never wanted you to die like this. If you truly were to die, then it should be. You wanted it to be in your hands, right?" Agaroth finished for her. The saint laughed, still caressing Agaroth's lips. "Yes. My lord, in the past you took everything from me. I, who was on the verge of attaining godhood, was instead destroyed by you." Before she had become the saint, she was known as the Twilight Witch. She had usurped control of a country, invaded the surrounding countries, and sacrificed everyone that she could get her hands on in a bid to take her place as the god of evil. However, just when her goal was right in front of her, she had been overthrown by Agaroth. The saint confessed, "My lord, I hated you. I wanted revenge on you. But you viewed my hatred and desire for revenge as a source of entertainment. You were looking forward to me attempting to take my revenge on you someday, eventually." Agaroth didn't deny these words, because they were the truth. The Twilight Witch had committed many evil deeds, but Agaroth didn't really consider those to be character faults. In this current era, anyone was justified in doing anything they could to survive. In any case, the Twilight Witch had failed, so Agaroth had taken her as his trophy. So what if she would someday seek revenge? For Agaroth, keeping someone who was giving off such dangerous intentions by his side was quite an amusement. But now, all that was in vain. The saint sighed, her finger which had been caressing Agaroth's lips falling away. As Agaroth's vision restored itself, he was able to see the saint's current visage. She looked a right mess. Diving in to carry away Agaroth, who had been swept away by the dark power of destruction, was no different than immersing your entire body in a river of death. Agaroth was left staring into the half-dissolved face of the saint. Still, Agaroth wasn't surprised. This was because he had already guessed it. At this close distance, there was no way that he could miss the smell of blood coming from her. "With my face like this, I am embarrassed to show you such an ugly sight," the saint whispered, her lips having been torn into pieces. Agaroth scoffed, "What do you mean? You're just as beautiful as you always are." If she had truly wanted to betray him, she could have done so at any time. Her title as the saint had been prepared for when she eventually fell into corruption. If a saint was to betray the God whom she had sworn to while killing countless of his believers, she could have easily become an evil god, obtaining the power that she had pursued for so long. But she hadn't done so. "My lord," the saint whispered, "in these last moments of ours I will have to deny your will. I won't run from here. My lord, I won't see you die before me." "All right," Agaroth agreed with a wry smile as he reached out his hand. Agaroth's hand gently caressed the saint's cheek, and the saint tilted her head up towards him with a weak smile. "If you have any last wishes, I will hear them," Agaroth offered. "My lord is so merciful. The saint chuckled as she held Agaroth's face between both her hands. A kiss. The saint's breath drew closer to his skin. And also my death. Their lips touched. Agaroth's hands wrapped around the saint's neck. A smile was drawn across the saint's blood-stained lips. Agaroth immediately laid down the deceased saint. Even though she had died when her neck was broken, there was still a smile on her face, and the blood from where her lips had touched Agaroth's own remained stained in place like lipstick. Agaroth placed the ring that he was holding on top of the saint's chest. You will all be dying here today. There are no other options. All of you will definitely perish here. I guess that was a divine prophecy, Agaroth chuckled as he turned his head. And you'll be dead along with you. The colors had slowly been creeping towards him. The demon king of destruction was now right in front of him. The corpses of his deceased believers also covered the plain before him. Agaroth created a new divine sword in his hands as he stared at the demon king of destruction. He held the divine sword aloft, and then he poured all of his remaining divine power into it. Apart from that, he didn't perform any other miracles. Against that thing, a god's miracles were meaningless. Facing it like this, standing on his own 2 feet, and being able to point his sword at it was a miracle in its own right. Agaroth was silent as light shone from him. He was aware of all the corpses in front of him. Inside his body he felt a void where their voices could no longer be heard. But at this moment his heart was calm. That thing didn't possess any rage, hatred, or other such emotions. It operated more like a natural disaster than anything else. It didn't move with any malice or murderous intent. Agaroth ground his teeth. So what if it wasn't moving with malice or murderous intent? Did that mean there was no need for him to feel rage or hatred? There was nothing in this world that said that he shouldn't. Rage and hatred were both a matter of personal feelings. In front of this destruction that had suddenly appeared out of nowhere and sought to end everything, what reason was there not to feel rage and hatred toward it? Agaroth might be a god, but he had once been a human, and his lifetime spent as a human was longer than his lifetime spent as a god. Because of that, in front of this destruction that could not be resisted by human efforts and could only be described as a calamity, Agaroth felt the most human rage and hatred towards it. Agaroth raised his divine sword and stepped forward. Just like when the demon king of destruction first appeared, he continued to advance towards it without stopping. Agaroth met the demon king of destruction, and the swirling, expanding wall of colors engulfed Agaroth. After that, the demon king of destruction finally came to a halt. It didn't move from that spot for several days. 1. The original word used here is literally translated as incarnation. It's used to describe the mighty warrior as the embodiment of all that the god of war stands for. However, considering that Agaroth is right there, it felt wrong to use incarnation here, so I went with chosen instead. Chapter 4:10. The Battlefield 4. At that point the memory proceeded to become a bit fragmented. Having been swallowed by the demon king of destruction, Agaroth did not die immediately. Instead, he wandered through an abyss that seemed to have no end and continued to slice apart the overflowing torrent of dark power and colors. In the face of such destruction that could render all efforts at resistance meaningless, gods and humans were rendered equal. That was just how things were. However, Agaroth managed to survive within destruction for a very long time. Even with the dark power trying to drive him crazy, he managed to retain his sanity. He refused to forget who he was. Many of the voices within him had already disappeared, but a few could still be heard coming from very far away. Those were the voices of the believers devoted to Agaroth. Along with these voices, Agaroth also thought of the believers who had already perished for him. His longtime friend whom Agaroth hadn't even been able to see in his final moments. The evil witch who had died after he broke her neck with these very hands. All of the comrades who had fought with him in one long war after another and always emerged victorious. And all of his other bonds too. Then there was himself. As the fragmented memory continued to play, Agaroth was gradually dying. He wandered through the endless abyss, swinging his sword again and again and again. His last memory was that of embedding his divine sword down in an empty place. He had forced his body to walk all this way, but in the end it finally gave in. He held himself up on the divine sword that he had been using as a cane. He died, Eugene realized as his eyes opened up. He stared down at the divine sword that he was holding out in front of him. The divine sword he was currently wielding looked very shabby compared to the sword he had just been looking at. Agaroth's divine sword. But more than that, Eugene could not stop his face from twisting into a scowl. His displeasure came from the fact that, while it was fortunate he had been able to recall Agaroth's memory, the memory wasn't complete. He hadn't even been able to draw upon all of Agaroth's memories, only remembering the memory from Agaroth's literal last moments. His war with the Nur, the descent of the Demon King of Destruction and his death. Eugene frowned silently. Despite his success, it was only natural that Eugene was not happy recalling Agaroth's memory. After all, within that memory he had embodied Agaroth. All of the emotions that Agaroth felt and the death of his believers, all of that had left an undeniable emotional residue on Eugene. Especially at the end when Agaroth's saint had died, and the emotions that Agaroth had felt at that moment. I at least know this much, Eugene muttered with a click of his tongue as he lowered his divine sword. Indifferent from Agaroth. Eugenie's closest past life was as Hamel. Influenced by the environment, education, experience and such that he had gone through from when he was reborn as a baby to the present day, Eugenie's personality wasn't necessarily the exact same as when he was Hamel. However, despite that, the current Eugene Lionheart couldn't also be said to be a completely different person from Hamel Dinah's. However, in Agaroth's case, Eugene couldn't help but feel various incongruities with the God of War's memory. What would Eugene have done in that situation? Eugene felt that he probably wouldn't even have chosen to fight with the Demon King of Destruction. If possible, he would have tried to retreat and make plans for the future, or well, if someone did have to be a sacrifice to stop it, then. I feel like I would have chosen to stay there on my own, Eugene decided. He didn't think he would have ordered his believers, who were begging him to run away, into a merciless advance. In fact, there hadn't really been a need for that. In the battle against the Demon King of Destruction, although that couldn't really have been called a battle, Agaroth's believers had been of no help when confronting the Demon King of Destruction. To put it harshly, their deaths had been more like a ritual sacrifice meant to accompany Agaroth in death. So why had Agaroth made such a decision? Even considering the era that they were in, Agaroth's identity as a human, and the fact that he had ascended humanity to be a god, Eugene still couldn't fully understand Agaroth's choice. Though in the first place, it would be ridiculous and arrogant of him to try and understand the mindset of a person from not just tens or hundreds of years but thousands of years ago. I also don't understand why he kept that saint by his side until the very end, Eugene thought with a frown. The Twilight Witch who became the saint of the God of War. She might not have been a black wizard, but she wasn't much different from one. She had used a kingdom as a testing ground for her magic, and in the end she attempted to become the god of evil by exterminating all of the kingdom's citizens. In other words, the saint had done something similar to what Edmund had attempted when he tried to become a greater demon king through his ritual. If it were Eugene, he would never have allowed such an insane person to live. No matter how capable they might be, he would have definitely killed them. He wouldn't have kept them by his side even if they swore eternal loyalty to him. But what about Agaroth? He had accepted that witch as his servant and had kept her right by his side. It wasn't like he didn't keep an eye on her, but he still left that witch with a relatively free rein, even hoping that she might one day pull her tricks on him. Eugene tried to think why Agaroth had done so. And in her final moments, that woman had died, not as a witch but as a saint. Even though she had had several opportunities to betray Agaroth along the way, she still ended up serving Agaroth faithfully. Eugene just couldn't understand all of that. This was partly because Agaroth's memories weren't complete and partly because their personalities as a whole were different. Even after seeing Agaroth's memory, questions still remained. In the darkroom under the Lionheart Manor, Eugene had seen a vision of a man walking through a wilderness filled with corpses, his shoulders slumped in despair. That figure should have been Agaroth, but there was no point at which the vision and Agaroth's memories overlapped. In his last moments, Agaroth hadn't despaired but had instead felt enraged and hateful. He stood face to face with the Demon King of Destruction, and instead of running away he stepped forward to meet it. Then in the end he was swallowed by the Demon King of Destruction and killed. Even though he was a god, Eugene mused. Instead of answering his questions, there were parts of Agaroth's memory that had raised even more doubts. Although it wasn't very prevalent in Agaroth's era, it was still possible for humans to become gods. Even though in that era, believers could still obtain divine power through their faith and were able to perform miracles, there were also professions such as priests and paladins. At the same time, the distance between the gods and the humans was very close. Agaroth, for example, had enjoyed drinking with his believers and celebrating alongside them with raucous banquets. In other words, this meant that humans were able to hear the voices of their gods whenever they wished. However, what about in the current era? Even in the case of the God of Light, who possessed the greatest number of believers, he barely ever communicated with his believers on earth. And the same went for the other gods. Looking at the existence of divine power and miracles, the existence of the gods was undeniable. But in the current era, apart from cases like Christina's, it was impossible for humans to hear the voices of their gods. And it's not like they had to receive worship to become a god. Like in the case of the Twilight Witch, it was also possible to become an evil god by becoming an object of fear through causing enough massacres, Eugene recalled. In a certain sense, this meant that the distance between humans and gods, while still clearly defined, hadn't been all that far apart. However, in the current era, such a thing was absurd to even think about. For a human to become a god? If that was really possible, then Vermouth would have already become one. There were also those who had achieved famous historical feats before him. Like the Magic King who had founded Aroth. Even Molin, who had established Ruhr, could have become a god in that case. As for guys like Edmund who wished to change their species, they could have aimed to become an evil god instead of a demon king. The world itself changed, Eugene suddenly realized. Agaroth's era was destroyed by the Demon King of Destruction. Then a new era began. And the current era was by no means similar to Agaroth's era, with differences starting from the very laws that made up the world. But why? Eugene silently pondered the question. But no matter how much he thought about it, there was no way to know. Since Agaroth had died before the destruction of the era, there was no way to know what had happened after that. Could I remember more if I wanted to? Eugene asked himself. Using the divine sword as a medium, Eugene had performed a miracle and recalled a memory that was engraved into his soul. Since he had already succeeded once, it seemed possible that he should be able to recall other memories. Perhaps he could even remember Agaroth's life from its very beginning. But he didn't really feel like doing so. Just recalling the moment of Agaroth's death had left Eugene feeling strange and uncomfortable. And he felt like his sense of self might be shaken if he tried to recall Agaroth's entire life. In the end, Hamel, Eugene, and Agaroth were all separate existences. If he really thought about it, there were many similarities between them, but there were just as many differences as well. Just being aware of my past life was already enough of a pain in the ass. But to think that I have to consider the past life of my past life, Eugene grumbled to himself. Was it possible that any of his entanglements from that era had been reincarnated into the present day? Eugene didn't want to think too deeply about that possibility. That bastard, Eugene cursed as he idly swung the divine sword still in his hands. The dark red light of the sword's divine power was undoubtedly distinct. But Eugene couldn't be satisfied with just that. He was strong, Eugene reluctantly admitted. Even when he was a human, Agaroth had managed to slay demon kings. And he had also killed many more demon kings after becoming a god. Eugene tried to piece together some faint memories. Although it would be difficult to create a ranking of the different demon kings from the two eras, the demon kings of Agaroth's era were at least more numerous than the demon kings of this era. But even without using any fancy or esoteric techniques, Agaroth had been strong enough to defeat them. Eugene had been able to clearly feel that much at the very least. At the moment when he had clashed with the Demon King of Destruction, Agaroth may have been placed into a weakened state by the prolonged war. But even so, his instincts and skills in battle had been as sharp as ever. Eugene might also have a lot of experience when it came to things like combat in the battlefield, but it was nothing compared to Agaroth's. After recalling those memories, it felt like a change had occurred in Eugenie's senses. And it wasn't a negative change. At this moment, Eugene couldn't be sure if he was actually stronger than he had been before, but he was sure that he would be able to fight better than he could before. I won't gain anything more from going any further out than this, Eugene decided. Instead, he might just get caught up in an unexpected situation. Eugene didn't really want to risk such a venture, so he quietly put away the divine sword. Then for a few moments he stood on top of the frozen sea and stared straight ahead. Although he had a wide-open view, his vision wasn't very clear. There was a haze out there that made it hard to see. Eugene quietly turned around and left. *****. Although Eugene had told them to head back in, Sienna and Anise were still standing outside the cave when he returned. After talking with them, Eugene learned that only 3 hours had passed since he had flown out towards Roguiaran. Molin was absent. Nur had shown up once again and Molan had left to kill it, so he would be back in a little while. I'm going to have a fight with Molan, Eugene said with a relaxed expression as if he was talking about going for a walk. However, Sienna and Anise couldn't listen to those words with the same sense of calm. Christina and Anise, who had watched as Eugene was beaten up by Molan last time, were especially horrified as they tried to stop Eugene. Hamel, what reason do you even have to fight with Molan? Sienna demanded. Molan's mental state isn't in a strange state any longer. Christina nodded. Sir Eugene, I also feel the same way. Does it really matter whether you won or lost last time? Similar to Christina, Sienna also had a worried expression. She had yet to see Molan's current power firsthand. However, if the Molan had truly been active for the past 300 years and, far from being lazy, had spent his days hunting the monster known as Nur, from what she knew of Molan, it was almost scary to imagine what sort of level he must have reached by now. Of course, Molan's time here was marked by his madness, so he hadn't been able to devote himself to his usual ascetic training, but the power Sienna sensed from him was incomparable to that of Molan from 300 years ago. Will you really be fine with losing like that? Sienna asked worriedly. I have no intention of losing, Eugene stubbornly insisted. Sienna frowned. Well, if you use the Moonlight Sword, the Holy Sword, and the Divine Sword, I guess you might be able to win. But Eugene, wouldn't that bother you? If you're fighting Molan with those weapons, it would mean that you're fighting him with the intent to kill, but there's no way that Molan will fight you in the same manner. I'm not going to use the Moonlight Sword or the Divine Sword, Eugene said as he pulled the Holy Sword out of his cloak. The only weapon I will use is the Holy Sword. I won't use ignition or prominence either. Aren't you being too arrogant? Anise muttered. Hamel, I know just how strong you are. However, compared to when you fought with Molan last time, I don't think that you will be able to have the upper hand under those conditions. Anise's words were accurate. Throughout the battles following the night march against the Death Knight, Edmund, Ryzakia, and Iris, Eugene had undoubtedly grown stronger with each battle. However, Eugenie's increased strength came from the changes in his white flame formula, along with the combination of ignition and prominence. That was also supported by the Moonlight Sword and Divine Sword. That would usually be the case, Eugene conceded. Eugene was also aware of all of that. In his last match with Molan, Eugene had been completely overwhelmed. Rather than being able to exchange equal blows with Molan, Eugene had been thrown around by Molan's strength, and he couldn't even get a complete read on Molan's moves. That's why I want to test it out, Eugene said, turning his head to the side as he propped the Holy Sword onto his shoulder. Feels like something in me has changed, but I'm not exactly sure about it myself. I can't really confirm it yet either. Having returned as Eugene was speaking, Molan was looking right back at Eugene. Eugene continued, I want to confirm what it is by fighting it out with someone, but it's rare for me to find someone I can really test myself against. It's even rarer to find people who I can clearly tell are stronger than me. Is that so? Molan murmured as he wiped away the N's blood from his cheek with the back of his hand. He stroked his bushy beard for a few moments as he was lost in thought. I understand what you mean, Hamel. If you truly want to test yourself, then in this world, apart from me, who else would be able to really put you to the test? Molan said with a grin and a nod of his head. Hamel, if that's what you want, I'm willing to spar with you at any time. After all, that is what I have always wanted, even back then 300 years ago. However, for this match I also have to make a personal request. A request? What is it? Eugene raised a brow. To think that Molan would actually ask for something in exchange for a spar. Since no one could ever have imagined Molan saying such words, they were all staring at Molan in surprise. Even while being on the receiving end of such stares, Molan kept up a serious expression that showed no signs of wavering. If I win, Hamel, you have to shout I've lost 5 times, Molan demanded. Eugene was struck dumb. Molan continued, you also have to write down I, Hamel Dynas, lost this match with Molan roar. Eugene stayed silent. And finally, you have to swear that you won't make up any other excuses for your defeat, Molan finished with a nod. Eugenie's lips twitched in anger as he listened to Molan speak. Anise and Sienna, who had been listening in rapt attention as Molan laid out his terms, burst into laughter and started slapping at each other's arms in amusement. Eugene growled, you son of a bitch. You really have been holding such a petty grudge, haven't you? Molan blinked innocently. Hamel, I don't understand what you mean by that. I have never once been accused of being petty. You've been keeping a grudge buried within your chest because I said that I would have won if we'd been holding weapons. Eugene accused. Of course not, Hamel, Mullen muttered in denial while attempting to avoid eye contact. Also, in my opinion, the one being petty is you, not me, Hamel. It was a fair fight, man to man, but who was it that had to go and make up some kind of excuse afterward? Mullen's voice was quieter and faster-paced than usual. Such words seemed uncharacteristic of Mullen. However, Eugene couldn't come up with any way to refute his words. Even so, Eugene couldn't just sit still and continue listening to this, so, with trembling lips, he shouted, You're stupid. You big idiot. Sometimes, when people really couldn't find an appropriate response to make, they would start making some extremely ugly personal attacks instead.